40 years before a single cow was ever driven up the Chisholm Trail, before the word cowboy meant anything to anyone. Men were already living deep in the Rocky Mountains, trading with tribes no government back east had ever formally met, and drawing the first accurate maps of rivers and mountain passes that wagon trains would follow for the next half-century. They were not there for gold, and they were not there for land. They were there for a rodent. The desire for a single animal, hunted almost to extinction across 2 continents to satisfy a European fashion trend, is the actual reason the American and Canadian West was mapped, settled, and fought over before the cattle industry existed in any organized form at all. This is the story of fur, specifically beaver fur, and how a hat became valuable enough to justify chartering companies that governed more land than most kingdoms in Europe, sparking wars between native nations for control of trade routes and sending men alone into wilderness that no European had ever charted. Decades before manifest destiny was even a phrase anyone used. The entire fur trade that would eventually reshape a continent began with a fashion problem in Europe that had almost nothing to do with America at all. Beginning in the 15th century and accelerating sharply through the 16th and 17th centuries, wide-brimmed felt hats became an essential marker of status and respectability across European society, worn by everyone from merchants to nobility to clergy. And the finest felt available for these hats came specifically from beaver fur. Beaver underfur has a microscopic structure covered in tiny barbs, distinct from the guard hairs on top of the pelt, and those barbs allow the fur to mat together into an extraordinarily dense, durable felt that held its shape far better than felt made from rabbit or other more common furs, meaning a beaver felt hat looked sharper and lasted longer than any competing alternative on the market. Demand grew so intensely across France, England, and the Low Countries that the European beaver, castor fiber, was hunted to near extinction across most of the continent by the early 1600s, with wild populations surviving in only isolated pockets of Scandinavia and Russia by the time European colonization of North America began in earnest. European hat makers were, quite literally, running out of raw material at the exact moment French and English ships began establishing permanent footholds along the North American coastline. And it did not take long for traders to realize that the forests of what is now Canada and the northern United States were teeming with an animal that had just become one of the most sought-after commodities in the European economy. French explorers were the first to recognize and act on that opportunity at meaningful scale, and the trading relationships they built with indigenous nations along the St. Lawrence River would define the entire structure of the North American fur trade for the next 2 centuries. Jacques Cartier had already made contact with indigenous peoples along the St. Lawrence in the 1530s, but it was Samuel de Champlain, founding the settlement of Quebec in 1608, who established the trading post that would become the commercial and political anchor of French fur trading in North America. Champlain deliberately built alliances with the Huron and various Algonquin nations, understanding correctly that French traders could not simply walk into the interior and harvest beaver pelts themselves at any meaningful scale. Success depended entirely on indigenous trappers who possessed generations of accumulated knowledge about beaver habitat, seasonal trapping techniques, and interior river networks that no French newcomer could replicate. In exchange for pelts, French traders offered metal tools, firearms, woolen cloth, and other manufactured goods that indigenous communities had never had access to before, creating an economic relationship that, within a generation or 2, restructured indigenous trade networks that had existed across the continent for centuries before any European ship arrived. A distinctly French class of trader known as the coureurs des bois, meaning runners of the woods, emerged from this system. French colonists who lived for extended periods among indigenous communities deep in the interior, learning languages, forming marriages and kinship ties, and pushing the fur trade's geographic reach steadily westward, well beyond the boundaries of any formal French colonial administration. The scale and profitability of this French trading network did not go unnoticed by rival European powers, and one of the boldest and most consequential responses came not from a government army, but from a private company granted powers that, in practical terms, made it something closer to a government of its own. In 1670, King Charles II of England granted a royal charter to the Hudson's Bay Company, giving it not merely trading rights, but outright ownership and governing authority over an almost incomprehensibly vast territory known as Rupert's Land, defined as the entire drainage basin flowing into Hudson Bay, a region that encompassed roughly 1/3 of what is today Canada, extending across parts of modern Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. This was not a conventional trading license. The Hudson's Bay Company held legal authority to establish courts, enforce law, wage war if necessary, and govern the indigenous and settler population within its territory, answerable in theory to the English Crown, but in practice operating with almost total autonomy across a landmass larger than most European nations combined, for a length of time that would stretch on for 2 centuries. The company established fortified trading posts along the shores of Hudson Bay itself, waiting for indigenous trappers to bring pelts to them rather than sending traders deep into the interior, the way the French coureurs des bois did, a more passive strategy that worked reasonably well for the company's first century of operation, but would eventually leave it vulnerable to a far more aggressive rival emerging from the same French trading traditions Champlain had established generations earlier. That rival arrived in 1779 when a group of Montreal-based merchants, many of them descended from or connected to the earlier French trading networks that had persisted even after Britain took formal control of Canada following the 7 Years' War, formed the Northwest Company specifically to challenge the Hudson's Bay Company's dominance. Where the Hudson's Bay Company waited at coastal posts, the Northwest Company adopted the older French model aggressively, pushing traders directly into the deep interior to establish trading relationships closer to the source. And this rivalry between the two companies became one of the most powerful engines of geographic exploration in North American history, arguably more consequential in mapping the continent's interior than any government-funded expedition of the era. Northwest Company partners and employees, driven purely by the commercial need to find new beaver populations and new trade routes before their rivals did, ended up charting enormous stretches of previously unmapped territory almost as a byproduct of pursuing profit. Alexander Mackenzie, a Northwest Company partner, became the first European to complete a transcontinental crossing of North America, north of Mexico, reaching the Pacific coast overland in 1793, a full 12 years before the American Lewis and Clark expedition would achieve a similar overland crossing further south. Simon Fraser, another company trader, navigated and mapped the treacherous river in British Columbia that now bears his name, while David Thompson, working first for the Hudson's Bay Company and later the Northwest Company, is credited with surveying and mapping roughly 4 million square kilometers of North American territory over his career, producing some of the most accurate and detailed maps of the western interior that existed anywhere for decades afterward. None of these men were funded primarily as explorers. They were fur traders whose employers needed to know exactly where the beaver were, and exploration was simply the unavoidable cost of finding out. While Canadian fur companies were racing each other across the northern interior, an entirely separate fur trading empire was taking shape south of the border, built by a single immigrant merchant whose ambitions would eventually make him the wealthiest man in the United States. John Jacob Astor, a German immigrant who arrived in the United States in the 1780s, built the American Fur Company into the dominant fur trading enterprise in the young United States through the early 1800s, eventually establishing a trading post named Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River in 1811, intended as the anchor of a fur trading network stretching from the Pacific coast back across the continent to established American markets. The American fur trade and the young republic's broader push westward were deeply intertwined from the very beginning. The Lewis and Clark expedition, commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson and undertaken between 1804 and 1806, was framed publicly around scientific exploration and diplomatic outreach to indigenous nations. But Jefferson's instructions to the expedition explicitly included detailed directions to document fur-bearing animal populations and assess the commercial potential of a fur trade route to the Pacific, reflecting how central this single commodity already was to American strategic thinking about the West, years before any organized settlement push began. Astor's fortune, built almost entirely on beaver pelts, moving from the American interior through New York and onto European hat manufacturers, made him, by some estimates, the wealthiest individual in the United States by the time of his death in 1848. A scale of personal wealth built on a trade that most Americans today associate, if they think of it at all, with quaint frontier nostalgia rather than one of the largest commercial enterprises of the early Republic. While French and English companies were building their trading empires across the eastern and central regions of the continent, an entirely separate fur trading frontier was opening on the opposite coast, driven not by beaver, but by an even more valuable marine animal, and pursued by an empire expanding from the other direction entirely. Russian expansion into the North Pacific began in earnest following Vitus Bering's voyages of exploration in the 1740s, which revealed the coastline of Alaska to European knowledge for the first time and, more consequentially for the fur trade, revealed enormous populations of sea otters along that coastline, an animal whose fur was, and remains, considered among the densest and most luxurious of any mammal on Earth. Russian fur hunters and merchants, known as Promyshleniki, pushed rapidly along the Aleutian Islands and onto the Alaskan mainland through the second half of the 1700s, and their methods for extracting labor from the indigenous Aleut population were considerably harsher than the trading partnerships the French had built with Great Lakes nations, frequently involving outright coercion, forced hunting quotas, and the taking of hostages to ensure Aleut hunters continued supplying pelts, a system that in several documented instances escalated into violent suppression of resistance and produced Aleut population losses during the early decades of Russian contact that some historians consider comparable in severity, on a smaller regional scale, to other forced extraction regimes of the era. The Russian-American Company, chartered in 1799 along lines broadly similar to the Hudson's Bay Company's earlier royal charter, was granted a trading monopoly across Russian America and extended Russian commercial reach remarkably far south along the Pacific coast, establishing Fort Ross in what is now Northern California in 1812, less than 90 miles north of the site where Spanish missionaries had already been operating for decades. A striking illustration of just how far the pursuit of a single fur-bearing animal could push an empire's practical frontier, in this case nearly to the doorstep of Mexican California. That entire settlement, Astoria, which John Jacob Astor had established with such ambition at the mouth of the Columbia River in 1811, would itself become a casualty of the same imperial competition unfolding on the opposite side of the continent, when the outbreak of the War of 1812 between the United States and Britain left Astor's isolated Pacific outpost dangerously exposed. Fearing seizure by British naval forces operating in the Pacific, Astor's partners sold the post to the rival Northwest Company in 1813 rather than risk losing it outright to military capture. And Astoria passed into British hands for the following decades, a setback that Astor never fully forgave and that the American writer Washington Irving later chronicled in his 1836 book Astoria, helping cement the settlement's brief, ambitious existence into American frontier memory, even though the post itself had failed to achieve the lasting commercial dominance Astor originally envisioned for it. Even as these territorial rivalries played out across two coasts and a continent's interior, the day-to-day mechanics of the fur trade itself operated through a remarkably specific and enduring system of value, one that reveals just how thoroughly a single animal pelt had become a functioning currency across an enormous stretch of North America. The Hudson's Bay Company developed a standardized unit of trade known as the made beaver, essentially a benchmark value equal to one prime, well-prepared beaver pelt, against which every other trade good, from firearms to blankets to kettles to the pelts of other animals like marten and fox, was formally priced in company ledgers across every trading post in its territory. A trapper arriving at a post did not simply barter item for item. He was credited a specific number of made beaver units for his furs, which he then spent against a fixed price list of available goods, a system sophisticated enough that some economic historians consider it one of the more advanced pre-industrial trading currencies operating anywhere in the world during this period. Beyond the pelt itself, the fur trade also generated demand for a substance called castoreum, a scent gland secretion beavers used to mark territory, which European apothecaries and perfumers of the era believed carried genuine medicinal properties and used as an ingredient in remedies for ailments ranging from headaches to fevers, adding a secondary, smaller but persistent market for the same animal that was already being hunted intensively for its fur, and giving trappers an additional financial incentive layered on top of the pelt trade itself. The most romanticized figures in this entire story, the mountain men who lived alone or in small groups deep in the Rocky Mountains for months or years at a stretch, emerged from a specific business innovation that fundamentally changed how the American fur trade operated. And their solitary treks through unmapped terrain would end up charting routes that later settlers relied on almost exactly as drawn. In 1825, a fur trader named William Ashley, operating what would become known as the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, introduced a system called the rendezvous, an annual summer gathering held at a predetermined location in the Rocky Mountains, where independent trappers would bring their season's collection of beaver pelts to trade directly for supplies, ammunition, and payment, without needing to travel all the way back to a permanent fort or settlement. This system freed trappers to range far more widely and independently than the older fort-based trading model allowed. And it produced a distinctive class of frontiersmen, men like Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger, and Kit Carson, who spent years living almost entirely in the wilderness, trapping beaver along remote mountain streams, negotiating and often intermarrying with indigenous communities, and in the process, becoming the first non-indigenous people to see and traverse vast stretches of the American West. Jedediah Smith, in particular, is credited with rediscovering South Pass in present-day Wyoming in 1824, a broad, gently graded crossing point through the Rocky Mountains that had been known to indigenous nations for generations but was unknown to American settlers. And this single mountain pass, found by a trapper searching purely for new beaver territory, would become the primary route used decades later by the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and the Mormon Trail, carrying hundreds of thousands of American settlers westward through terrain that fur trappers had already mapped and traveled through repeatedly, years before any of those famous wagon trails existed as an organized migration route at all. The dangers these men faced were not exaggerated by later storytelling. Among the most famous documented survival stories of the entire mountain man era is that of Hugh Glass, a trapper working with a Rocky Mountain Fur Company expedition in 1823, who was severely mauled by a grizzly bear while scouting ahead of his party along the Grand River in present-day South Dakota, suffering wounds serious enough that the two men left behind to bury him, believing his death imminent, eventually abandoned him and rejoined the main party instead, taking his rifle and equipment with them. Glass survived regardless, and according to accounts recorded by his contemporaries, crawled and walked roughly 200 miles across open, dangerous terrain back to the nearest trading post, an ordeal that became one of the defining legends of the fur trade era, precisely because it was not unusual in kind, only in the severity of its outcome, for men who spent entire seasons alone in grizzly and wolf territory, hundreds of miles from any settlement that could offer help if something went wrong. The rendezvous system and the trapper culture surrounding it also produced a distinct and lasting cultural legacy through the intermarriage between French and British fur traders and indigenous women, particularly across the Canadian prairies, giving rise to the Métis people, a genuinely new indigenous nation with its own language, known as Mishif, its own customs, and its own political identity, formed directly out of generations of fur trade contact and kinship. Métis hunters and traders became indispensable intermediaries for both the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, and Métis communities would later play a central and often turbulent role in the political history of the Canadian prairies, including the Red River Resistance of 1869 and the Northwest Resistance of 1885, both led by the Métis leader Louis Riel. Conflicts that emerged directly from tensions between Métis land claims and the same Canadian government that had purchased Rupert's land from the Hudson's Bay Company, tracing a direct line from the fur trade's earliest intermarriages to major political conflicts unfolding 2 centuries later, when the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, after decades of increasingly violent competition that had included armed clashes between rival trading posts and a level of commercial warfare that occasionally spilled into genuine bloodshed, were formally merged under pressure from the British government, which viewed the ongoing conflict between the 2 companies as a threat to stable governance across British North America. The merger left the Hudson's Bay Company as the unchallenged dominant force across the entire northern fur trading territory, controlling trade, transportation, and in practical terms, local governance across a landmass that included nearly all of what is now Western and Northern Canada. A level of private corporate control over territory that has almost no modern equivalent anywhere in the world. Hudson's Bay Company forts functioned simultaneously as trading posts, diplomatic centers for negotiating with indigenous nations, and de facto centers of local law and order, often the only formal institution of any kind for hundreds of miles in any direction. Decades before the Canadian government extended any direct administrative presence into these territories at all. The commercial rivalry that had driven so much of this exploration reached a decisive turning point in 1821, when the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, after decades of increasingly violent competition that had included armed clashes between rival trading posts and a level of commercial warfare that occasionally spilled into genuine bloodshed, were formally merged under pressure from the British government, which viewed the ongoing conflict between the 2 companies as a threat to stable governance across British North America. The merger left the Hudson's Bay Company as the unchallenged dominant force across the entire northern fur trading territory, controlling trade, transportation, and in practical terms, local governance across a landmass that included nearly all of what is now Western and Northern Canada, a level of private corporate control over territory that has almost no modern equivalent anywhere in the world. Hudson's Bay Company forts functioned simultaneously as trading posts, diplomatic centers for negotiating with indigenous nations, and de facto centers of local law and order, often the only formal institution of any kind for hundreds of miles in any direction. Decades before the Canadian government extended any direct administrative presence into these territories at all. Even as these companies reached the height of their commercial and territorial power, the underlying resource that their entire business model depended on was already collapsing under the weight of the demand it had created. A crisis that arrived from 2 directions at almost exactly the same time. Beaver populations across the trapped regions of North America had been declining steadily for well over a century by the 1830s, as trapping pressure consistently outpaced the beaver's reproductive capacity across region after region, forcing companies and independent trappers alike to push further and further into ever more remote territory in search of populations that had not yet been depleted, which is precisely why the geographic reach of the fur trade kept expanding so dramatically decade after decade. At the same moment, this ecological crisis was deepening. European fashion tastes shifted in a way that dealt the beaver felt hat. Industry its final and most decisive blow. Through the 1830s, silk top hats, manufactured using silk imported primarily from China, began displacing beaver felt as the fashionable headwear of choice among European elites. A shift accelerated significantly when King Louis Philippe of France was seen wearing a silk hat, an image that rippled through European fashion circles and rapidly made silk the new mark of sophistication that beaver felt had represented for the previous 2 centuries. The combined effect of a collapsing wild beaver population and a rapidly declining European market for beaver felt hats caused the fur trade's commercial center of gravity to shift permanently by the mid-1800s, away from beaver specifically and toward other furs, including buffalo hides, which would soon become the target of an entirely separate and equally devastating chapter of North American wildlife exploitation. The human cost of this 2-century commercial enterprise fell overwhelmingly and disproportionately on the indigenous nations whose knowledge, labor, and territory had made the entire trade possible in the first place. And that cost extended far beyond simple economic exploitation into outright warfare between indigenous nations competing for control of increasingly valuable trade routes and hunting territories. The most severe of these conflicts, known collectively as the Beaver Wars, unfolded through much of the 17th century, as the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, fought an extended and often devastating series of conflicts against French allied nations, including the Huron, the Petun, and various Algonquin peoples, largely over control of beaver trapping territory and the trade routes needed to move pelts to European buyers, at a time when Haudenosaunee territory itself had already been significantly depleted of beaver by decades of intensive trapping to supply Dutch and later English traders operating out of the Hudson River Valley. These conflicts, fought with firearms that indigenous nations had only recently acquired through the very trade networks now driving the violence, resulted in the displacement and, in some documented cases, the near destruction of entire indigenous nations, reshaping the political and demographic map of the eastern Great Lakes region in ways that persisted for generations afterward. Beyond direct warfare, the broader fur trade economy fundamentally restructured indigenous economic life across the continent, creating dependency relationships on European manufactured goods, including firearms and alcohol, that undermined traditional subsistence practices in many communities. While European diseases, spreading along the same trade routes and through the same close, sustained contact the fur trade required, devastated indigenous populations who had no prior immunity to smallpox, measles, and other pathogens carried by traders and settlers moving through their territory. By the time the beaver trade had fully run its course as the continent's dominant commercial enterprise, the men, companies, and trails it had produced had already permanently reshaped how the American and Canadian West would be settled, explored, and governed for the following century, in ways the cattle industry that came decades later would simply inherit rather than originate. In 1869, the Hudson's Bay Company sold Rupert's Land, its vast territorial holding across the Canadian interior, to the newly formed Dominion of Canada for a payment of £300,000 sterling, formally transferring governing authority over a landmass roughly the size of Western Europe from a private trading corporation to an actual national government for the first time in 2 centuries, and that transferred territory would go on to form the core of the modern Canadian provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. South of the border, the mountain passes, river crossings, and overland routes that fur trappers like Jedediah Smith had discovered and repeatedly traveled decades earlier became, almost without modification, the exact paths later followed by the Oregon Trail beginning in the 1840s, the California Trail during the Gold Rush years, and eventually the surveyors who mapped potential routes for the American Transcontinental Railroad completed in 1869, the very same year the Hudson's Bay Company sold its Canadian territory. The organized cattle drives that Hollywood Westerns would later make the defining symbol of American frontier expansion, most famously along the Chisholm Trail beginning in 1867, arrived across landscapes that fur trappers, traders, and the indigenous nations who guided and partnered with them had already been navigating, mapping, and fundamentally reshaping for the better part of 200 years before a single longhorn steer crossed the Red River, heading north toward the Kansas railheads. The beaver itself very nearly did not survive to see any of this legacy recognized. By the early 20th century, beaver populations across much of North America had been reduced to a small fraction of their pre-contact numbers, driven to local extinction across huge stretches of their former range by roughly 3 centuries of sustained commercial trapping pressure. It was only through deliberate 20th century conservation efforts, including protected trapping seasons, habitat protection, and in some notable cases, the physical relocation and reintroduction of beavers into regions where they had disappeared entirely, that North American beaver populations began a slow, sustained recovery through the middle decades of the 1900s, a recovery that continues today across much of their historic range. Allowing an animal that once financed empires, sparked wars, and drew the first maps of a continent to quietly return to rivers and streams it had been driven out of for the better part of 2 centuries. The frontier that generations of Americans have pictured through the lens of cattle drives, cowboys, and dusty cattle towns was, in every meaningful geographic and commercial sense, already opened, mapped, and economically transformed by an entirely different set of men, chasing an entirely different animal decades before any of that more familiar imagery existed. French traders in birch-bark canoes, English chartered companies governing territory the size of nations, mountain men living alone through brutal winters for a season's worth of pelts, and indigenous nations whose knowledge, labor, and territory underwrote the entire enterprise, together built the roads, found the passes, and established the trading relationships that every subsequent wave of westward American expansion would simply follow. The hat that started it all, the fashionable European headwear that made a small aquatic rodent worth more than almost any other commodity in North America for the better part of 2 centuries, has largely vanished from modern memory, replaced culturally by an image of cowboys and cattle that arrived on a stage the fur trade had already built. Even the political map that resulted, the border between the United States and Canada running west from the Great Lakes, the provincial lines carved out of the old Rupert's land purchase, and the Métis Nation born directly from generations of fur trade marriages, all trace back through the same original chain of cause and effect that began with European hat makers running short of beaver felt sometime in the early 1600s. If this story of the animal, the hat, and the trade that quietly opened an entire continent surprised you, subscribe to Fabric Myths for more deep dives into the materials and commodities that shaped history far more than most people ever learn in school. Let us know in the comments which part of this story stood out most to you, whether it was Jedediah Smith rediscovering South Pass, the sheer scale of territory the Hudson's Bay Company once governed, or the Beaver Wars fought between indigenous nations over trapping territory. And tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight, and if there is another fabric or fiber whose true origin story deserves this same treatment, leave that suggestion below. We read every one of them.